Good morning.
morning.
I'm Pastor Jane Gingrich, serving Hills of Peace Lutheran Church here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
And I'm Pastor John Boyd. I serve St. George's Anglican Parish here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
Welcome to our weekly conversation where we record one of the many topics that we talk about in a week as a clergy couple. This week our topic is moving from sprint to marathon. What does it look like to live a life of spirituality or faith in the time of COVID? Here we are, coming into October pretty quickly, looking at what it means to have been in this time of global pandemic, where in North America we've been experiencing shutdown. BC, maybe we should say more specifically, since last March, and have made it through the summer, but are looking at what might be a second wave. Some things are shifting, and there's all this talk of the movement from brief sprint, which so many of us hoped would be over long ago, into the marathon or longer experience of this time of isolation and pandemic. What does it mean to live a life of faith in a time where so much is different from what it was 8 months ago?
I think about the passages that were written by St. Paul and other witnesses to the gospel in the early days of gathering the community of the church after the crucifixion of Christ. And there are those passages that speak about the purpose of suffering, and suffering that produces endurance, and endurance that produces character. And I hear those words in a spiritual sense, not just in a personality or psychological sense. And I think that we are beginning to live into the reality of the story of Israel as told to us in Scripture, the story of God's beloved and chosen community, and the different things that they also go through from a historical point of view, but have deep spiritual meaning for the pattern of life. And there are all those passages about a community in exile, a community that's sojourning in the desert on a journey to a destination that they don't even know when and where that is going to arrive. And I do think that, not to make light of the suffering or anything like that, but we are going to learn more and more firsthand what it means to be a Christian for the long haul. And we're learning firsthand the difference between a theology of glory, which is a very quick fix solution and it's over, as compared to a theology of the cross, which is lived up to and through, and that takes a lifetime. Plus there's just the contextual uncertainty, and maybe you could share more about the uncertainty of COVID and the anxiety that produces. How have you seen that reflected in your parish and your ministry?
Well, I think it's not just the anxiety of it, it's the exhaustion. I myself do not run marathons, but I have a very good friend who is a triathlete who also competes in Ironman competitions and marathons variously around the world. And she talks about that point in the race where everything's gone to jelly and you kind of turn numb and you really have to set your sight on the end in order to get there. And at this point right now, we don't have an end in sight. And so we're at that point where it feels like the legs are turning to jelly, but we don't have a goal in view. So the anxiety or the stresses or the concerns that I've heard are about those who continue to be isolated and alone. And so thinking about scriptural context, this last weekend, the Southern Interior Region congregations for the British Columbia Synod of Lutherans were gathered together online on Zoom for what used to be a convention, but at this point in time is a kind of a gathering to network and socialize and connect about ministry in the area and seek to support each other. And this year there was a lot of conversation about how to support one another. In our Bible study, in that gathering, we heard about a reading from the Psalms, listened to the reading, and then talked at length about what it means to be in exile, and historically what that looked like for generations, and now for us what that looks like when we're in a time of unknown desert exile, and how we cope and face that. And I think as we're imagining and experiencing this shift into longer term, and that's really sinking in, because for a while I think we've all thought it might get that way.
Right.
But now that it's really sinking in, it's that much more important to recognize where we have sources of connection. What is life-giving? How do we include a daily life of prayer in as part of our routine? Where can we be intentional about gratitude? And additionally, where do we find the human connection that we need to cope? I've been encouraging people to think of 2 people in your life you can hug. Make sure you got 2 people in your life you can hug, because there is such a sense of isolation and disconnect that it is very important to be clear that that's not the only thing happening right now. That we are running this race as part of many, not even just our own neighborhoods or communities or congregations. The whole world is going through this right now. And so how can we be that much more present to each other's struggle in this time, and recognize that in any moment of anxiety or stress or concern or loneliness, that we are part of many communities globally going through the same thing. And so, as you're describing from the writings of Paul and many of the letters that describe what it means to be communities of faith who are isolated, the Psalms where we hear about being in exile, several of the readings in the Old Testament that talk about being in the desert, and so many stories of God's people who have been apart and on long journeys. We're experiencing that now too.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you're hearing or observing about this shift from a brief period into a more longer period of pandemic that is affecting the community you serve?
I know that the shift in seasons is a concern, because what do we do for worship and for the way in which we gather with the onset of winter and inclement weather? And that becomes a concern for us in communities where Zoom and meeting is not always a preferred way of gathering. It doesn't have the same connection or atmosphere for people that gathering together in person does. And it makes certain things difficult. And also, just because certain people are at a stage in life where there is so much technology and different information and things to process already, it just becomes overwhelming. Especially for the sick and the shut-in terms of who we visit and minister to, and the people in my congregation visit and minister to themselves as well. So that's definitely an unknown quantity. How do we meet that challenge faithfully, and how do we do the best that we can according to the tools and the gifts that God has given us? And that's part of the endurance issue. Is it takes endurance spiritually to sit and to force yourself not to give up, to pray and to draw on the hope and the imagination and the gifts of the Holy Spirit, so that in faith you come to a solution, and the patience to sit there and say, I may not figure it out in 12 hours, I may not figure it out in a week, even of an intense series of council meetings and discussions, but we are going to continue to try because God calls us to faithfully go. And this journey that we have, this situation, is precisely the point. And I think that also becomes an incredibly important testament to the gospel itself in terms of the meaning of life and what we're going through. All too often, as I said, we want things to be over with. And it is very hard for us in our current modern lifestyle and mindset to realize that the end of all things, the finish line, as it were, is up to God and happens in a time that God lays out before us. One of the most poignant examples of how the situation and the journey itself is what we have, and how quickly we forget that and want to have something concluded or do something else, is in the territory of the people. Of course, the history of our journey with our First Nations community and Indigenous peoples that we've related to as an Anglican communion through the history of the residential schools. There are comments occasionally that you hear from settlers that want and wonder when the whole process is going to be over with in terms of the journey of reconciliation, or at what point do we stop talking about this subject, which is horrific and so uncomfortable and evil and painful. And that's where I think that as Christians who are called to serve our neighbors, we need to realize that the journey is precisely where we are called to be, and yet that suffering is, again, through the theology of the cross, through the faith in the crucified Christ that we have, that's exactly where we are called to be. It's not comfortable. And that if we experience this uncertainty and suffering in COVID, and there is struggle to serve each other and to maintain faithful community with each other in COVID, that experience also translates to the other work that we're called to do and the journeys that we're called to have with each other as faithful Christians in service to each other. So that's one way in which I think I see all of these different contexts of ministry echoing the same truth. What about ways in which your community, you have a variety of different ministries, you have a young adult supper, you have visitation, you have communion, which you as a community have managed to put into place safely. What are ways in which ministry itself has a different practice in terms of going from short-term solution to now long-term? I don't want to say new norms because that's overplayed, but if you get what I'm driving at.
I think so. I think part of the transition is even in those phone calls and visitations. Mm-hmm. The first while there were a number of people saying, "Oh, we'll be fine to the end, like don't worry about us." And now I think it's that much more important to be checking in again, connecting again, making sure that the phone calls aren't just, dare I say, to people who have wanted calls through this time right now, but doing another round of connecting with everybody. Because at this point, as we're shifting from the short term to when we thought there was an end in sight to now looking at what a length of time might be, I think there's a shift internally for many people, and it might be something that hasn't had a lot of space to be considered aloud. And so those conversations, even the questions of how are you doing, what are you up to, and how can we continue to support you, is a big part of the conversation. We're coming up with a lot of our own creativity in the office to initially seeking responses through questionnaire, this group who meets on Thursday, finding opportunities with committees, through council, to come up with as much creativity as possible together is another shift, because when it's going to be a short time, perhaps there aren't as many voices speaking up. But the longer that it is, the more that I think we need to be that much more inclusive, that much more intentional, find ways to share with each other when there is a particular day to honor, like today being the Orange Shirt Day, where we recognize every child matters, and honoring those who have survived residential schools and commemorating those who have not, honoring the history of so many that has been swept under the carpet for a really long time. And yet in a time like COVID, it makes it that much more easy to forget about some of these practices and national identities, and even in some cases celebrations, in other cases opportunities for learning and honoring that more easily get forgotten when people aren't gathering. So I think part of it looks like reminding each other about what's happening, what's important, and how to participate in new ways. We can still all wear orange shirts at home, share photos, put them online, call a friend and talk about what you know, or ask a question, or do a bit of research in the area you are. There's lots of ways to engage differently. I've seen so many races that Terry Fox run, number of marathons, many walks that have been done virtually, where you can log in and map your route and do a 5-kilometer race on your own time, at your own pace, but within the parameters or the length that would have been selected for that event. And so these are creative ideas that organizations beyond the church community have come up with. But within communities of faith, the way that we're going to be able to continue to best support each other is by listening to one another, and by checking in and asking what a person needs, and then working together to find creative solutions, because our needs are all shifting, and if we're not checking in with each other and allowing ourselves pause to think about what the needs are that are changing for ourselves as well, it's possible that we'll miss them until it's very uncomfortable. And we don't want to get to that point. We want to be able to support each other through in the best way that we're able throughout this time of isolation, pandemic, and challenge. Thank you for listening. Do join us tomorrow, Thursday morning, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. on Zoom for an ongoing conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Do join in with the link provided to you in an email, or find it in the Hills of Peace Facebook page event. See you tomorrow.